Hi everybody and welcome to English Digest. I'm Pat.
And I'm Elsie.
And today we're going to take a look at this month's translation unit. As usual, we've got a bunch of different sentences about different topics using different vocabulary words, grammar patterns, and so on. And our first topic that we're going to talk about is related to international news. So, Elsie, do you often pay attention to international rather than just local news?
Yeah, I sometimes watch CNN News with my husband when I have time. However, most of the time I watch Channel 55, which is about the Taiwanese news.
Okay. I will look at the BBC website pretty much every day, most days, to see what's going on. A bit more if there's something like a developing situation.
Yes.
As we're recording this, the UK is choosing its next, or some of the UK is choosing its next Prime Minister.
Oh, that's right.
It's not a big election. It's like their party is choosing a new leader. So by the time you listen to this, you'll probably know who it is. But right now, it's all up in the air.
Right, and there was a fire, right?
Oh,
a couple of days ago.
Also, the UK right now, when we're recording, is in the middle of a heat wave. So there are fires everywhere because stuff burns in the dry UK when it's this hot.
Right.
But of course, this year, there's been some pretty big news you can't really ignore, one of which we'll talk about, Russia invading Ukraine back in February. COVID-19, of course, won't go away. And in Taiwan, that's been big news since early on in the year.
And a lot of shootings in the U.S.
There's always a lot of shootings in the US, unfortunately. That never seems to go away.
Maybe I pay more attention to them, so...
Yeah, could be. But let's take that topic of Russia invading the Ukraine and look at our first pair of sentences. So we're going to start with part A, single sentence, sentence 1. Since Russia invaded Ukraine this February, Ukraine has been trying to apply for admission to the European Union.
今天的中文是呢，自今年2月俄罗斯入侵乌克兰，乌克兰就一直尝试申请进入欧盟。我们的时态用到的是前半句过去简单式，描述已经发生的事实。再来后半句要使用现在完成式，描述从过去持续到今天的动作。他们从那个时候就开始申请到今日。
So the European Union, or EU, is this big union of countries. No longer includes the UK, of course, anymore. But Ukraine has been asking to get in, and that will kind of give it a bit more protection and trade with the rest of the countries in Europe. And obviously, this is one of the biggest news stories from 2022. It's having effects on things like oil and gas prices and how the US and China are behaving around each other and so on. We're not going to really get into the details of this. We have other articles in magazines about this topic.
Okay, so let's look at some of the words in the sentence that we need to use.
Yeah, so we've got invade first. To invade means to move into somewhere. And it's an aggressive word. It's not you move somewhere just to live peacefully. You generally move into somewhere by attacking and trying to control an area that doesn't belong to you. We usually mean armies when we talk about invading another country, invading a new area. But we could also talk about a species of animals or something like that, invading a new area. We call this an invasive species, and it's often stronger than local species, which suffer as a result. When we turn this word into a noun, invade becomes invasion.
入侵这个动作呢，我们可以用 invade 这个动词，那名词形式是 invasion， 所以呢，本句前半句也可以翻译为 Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine this February， 好，用名词去代也是可以的。那再给同学们一个例句，让你更清楚入侵 invade 这个动词的使用方式。World War II began when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939， 也就是呢，第二次世界大战始于纳粹德国于西元1939年入侵波兰。
And we learn that since the Russian invasion, Ukraine wants to apply for admission to the EU. Let's look at the phrasal verb apply for first. And this means to formally ask to or formally ask for something. Like I apply for a loan. I want you to give me a loan. I want to apply for a passport. I'm sending all the forms so that you will give me a passport. It could also mean you formally ask to join something like a school, a program, or a group. But in that case, you'd need another noun. Here we have apply for admission to something. We're going to look at the word admission in just a moment, but let's take apply for first.
Apply for 代表是申请，那这边申请的意思其实有3种常见的用法。第一个，如果你用的是 apply for， 你后面要接的是你想要申请的项目，比如说你要申请护照 ，you apply for a passport， 或者是 visa， 或者是 grant。permission 或者是 admission 这一些字。那接下来如果你要把 for 拿掉，用 to apply to 后面就要接上的是单位或是机构的名称，表示向点点点提出申请。那再来第3种apply to 后面还可以加上原形动词，意思是申请去做某事。所以第一个例句说的是If Americans want to travel to China, they have to apply for a visa. 代表如果美国人想要去中国旅游，他们必须要申请签证。那还有一个是 After graduating from a college in Taiwan, Hank applied to a university in the US. 所以你这边看到他用的是 applied to 后面加这个单位这个机构，也就是在美国的大学。
Right, you apply for a thing, whether that thing is a real thing like a passport or something not quite so tangible like apply for permission, but you apply to a place or to a person. Apply to Mandy in the HR department, for example. So here we've got for, apply for, so we need a noun, and the noun is admission. Admission is like a formal way of saying entry. The verb form is admit. You can be admitted, formally joining a group, a university. You could apply for admission to a building. You're basically asking, can I come in officially, formally? So a soldier would deny ordinary people admission to a military base. You'd say, sorry, you're not allowed to come in. I can't give you admission. I can't admit you to this base. When we're talking about a big organization, a big international one like the EU or something like that, the World Health Organization, we definitely want to use admission because it's a formal word for applying to a formal, real organization.
进入的表示方法，如果要用名词的话，可以用 admission 或是 entry。那刚刚 Pat 有提到 admission 它比 entry 来的正式。好，那接下来要接什么呢？接一个 to 介系词，再接上单位或机构名称，表示加入或是允许进入某团体。所以呢，在句子当中，你也可以使用这2个字哦。那如果要用动词表示的话，这个部分你可以把它说成 trying to apply to join or enter the European Union. OK, 你可以把 apply to 后面加上原形动词。那再给同学一个例句哦。Rick was refused admission to the bar because he'd caused trouble there in the past. 由于 Rick 他过去在那间酒吧闯祸，所以他就不被允许进入那里。
So let's look at sentence 2, which says, however, because a majority of EU members oppose Ukraine's entry, it won't happen soon. This is carrying on the story of the first sentence, showing Ukraine likely won't join the EU soon.
中文是呢，然而由于多数欧盟会员反对乌克兰的加入，它将不会太快发生。那我们的时态要用的是前半句使用现在简单式描述一个事实，后半句呢我们要使用未来简单式描述未来的事实。
And this is because a majority of current members are saying no. When we use the phrase a majority of, this means most of, almost all of. Not 100%, but certainly many more than are saying the opposite thing, or yes.
多数我们可以用 a majority of 来表示，那名词 majority 表示多数，相反字少数呢，我们要用的是 minority。那本句当中的多数，我们也可以用 many, a lot of, most of 的来替换。For example, a majority of those who died from COVID-19 in Taiwan were already suffering from other diseases. 代表台湾多数新冠肺炎病末的人呢，先前已经罹患其他的疾病。
And if a majority of members are saying no to the Ukraine or to Ukraine, then they are opposing it. To oppose is a more formal way of saying no. They're rejecting, they're refusing. We could also say they are in opposition to it. They don't agree with the idea, and they are actively trying to stop it from happening. So there are a bunch of different ways you can say this.
反对，我们可以用以下的动词或片语来表示。那刚刚 Pat 有提到几个，我们再补充一下。这边句子上面用的 oppose 当然可以，后面直接加名词或是 VING。再来，你也可以用 be opposed to 或是 object to disagree on with or about 也是可以的。再来还有 disapprove of 或是 be against 后面全部都是加上名词或是 VING. So for example, many of the political parties own members oppose or are opposed to their leader's decision. 代表许多这个政党自家的党员都不支持他们党魁的决定。
Now, one of the differences there between oppose and are opposed to is the difference between active and passive. If you say they oppose it, it maybe means they're actually actively saying no, they're speaking out about it. If we just say they are opposed to, that probably means more like they don't agree with it, but they're not doing as much. So you can see where using the active voice or the passive voice does have a subtle change or cause a subtle change in what the sentence is trying to say. And it's the same with some of these synonyms for oppose. If you disapprove of something, that just means you don't like it and you don't agree with it, but you may not be actively working towards it. Whereas if you are against something, again, this shows you don't like the idea. It's a little stronger than disapprove of. It maybe means you are really doing something. If you object to it, then you're pretty much saying so. I object. I don't like this. Probably more publicly than in private. So yes, all of these are synonyms, but they do carry very slightly different meanings in what the reader is supposed to understand from the sentence.
是的，所以使用的时候还是要小心哦，它们的强烈，还有这个有没有行动都是有差别的。
So that is the first pair of sentences in Part A, all to do with the Russian invasion and what's going on with Ukraine and the EU and the political situation there. As I said, we're not going to really get into the details of why Ukraine are replying now, why states are opposing them and so on. That's for a big, long article on the subject that we're not going to get into in our translation unit. So what we'll do now is take a short break and we'll come back in a moment to look at sentence pair part B. Welcome back, everybody. Now let's look at Part B, another single sentence. And this second topic is more about a particular kind of food and how people have changed the way they view it. And this happens a lot with food. The way people think about certain dishes or ingredients changes over time. At one point they thought, oh, this is the best thing, and then 50 years later they think, oh no, this isn't a good thing at all. Maybe it's the fact that some of the food is rarer and then becomes more common, or is quite common and then becomes rare, and people's views about it change over time. Let's kind of explain the idea here by looking at the sentence itself. It says, in the past, lobsters were considered food for the poor, and the middle and upper classes found it shameful to eat them.
龙虾呢，在过去被视为是穷人的食物，人家都是不要吃它的，觉得穷人家才要吃龙虾。那中产与上层阶级呢，认为吃它们是很可耻的。那时态呢，我们当然要用的是 simple past 也就是过去简单式，描述已经发生的事实。Pat, I love lobster. Actually, I love seafood.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of seafood, and I do like lobster, but it's not the kind of thing you can eat very often, is it?
Right, because I think it's a lot more expensive to have lobster or eat lobster in Taiwan.
Yeah.
than in most of the Western countries, I would say.
Exactly the same, unless you happen to live in an area where there are like a lot of lobster farms or a natural area for lobsters.
Right.
When you might get them a bit more cheaply and more often. Otherwise, you think, oh, ordering the lobster, that's going to cost me a lot of money.
Yeah, but I've heard that lobsters were called sea rats or something?
Sea rats.
In the past?
Maybe that's because they, like a lot of creatures like that, they eat the kind of dirt at the bottom of the sea. In Chinese, they're dragon shrimp, right? Which is that sounds like they're high status.
Very royal.
Yeah, like dragons are big, important creatures. So dragon shrimp, wow, that sounds pretty fun.
We need to eat it.
Yeah, so let's explain this sentence before we get into the words. Lobsters were very common in the past, especially in the coastal areas of the US, and anything that's easy to get isn't considered too special. So when we use words like view, consider, think of, regard, deem, and so on, we're talking about perception, how some people see a particular thing, a person, and so on. There are many ways to say the same thing, all these different verbs and phrasal verbs, but you do need to be careful and pay attention because depending on which of these verbs you use, the structure that follows it can be a little different.
是的，你选不同的字，不同的用法，后面要加上去的东西也是会不一样的。那视为好，有以下的片语可以表示，像是 view, take, see, recognize, regard, think of, look upon， 或者是 refer to， 后面加上 a, as, be。好，第一个东西加上去 as 后面再加上第二个东西。那如果你要用的是 think, consider或者是 deem， 你后面是 A to be B， 那个 to be 是可以省略掉的。所以呢，我们给同学们一个例句哦。I consider this plan to be a mistake. I don't think there's any way it will work. 我认为这项计划是一个错误，我不认为它在任何方式下行得通。那这里你用到 consider A to be B， 那个 to be 是可以拿掉的。
Yeah, you wouldn't say, I consider this as something. I deem this as a bad idea. You just say, I deem it a bad idea, or I deem it to be a bad idea. So make sure you know that whether it's as, whether it's to be, or whether you can just skip that and omit the to be, just make sure you're following the verb with the right structure. So, who saw these lobsters as food for the poor? Well, the sentences says the upper classes, the upper and middle classes. So here we're not talking classes like in school, we're talking about social classes. Traditionally, especially in the West, we had the upper classes, the upper class. These are the very rich. They own large areas of land. They own big businesses, or they don't need to have businesses and jobs because their family money and their income from their land means they can just do whatever they like. And in the past, we'd say these were the nobles, the kings, the rulers of the country. Now, the middle class are the townspeople. They are the small business owners. They're skilled professionals like doctors and teachers. And then there's the working class or the lower class. These are farmers, factory workers, people who make and produce the things that are bought by others. Now, things have changed a bit. It's no longer so easy to just separate into upper, middle, lower, or working. The ways of working have changed. We don't just make things and buy and sell things anymore. We have internet jobs, we have ideas, we have other things like that. There are many other kinds of classes. You can find references to this sort of thing online. And the class you belong to depends on things like how much money do you make? What job do you have? How old are you? Where do you live? City, country, big city? How much income do you have to spend on other things? All of that sort of stuff factors into what social class you belong to.
这边我们看到的 class 指的不是班级，指的是阶级，特别指的是社会阶级。那常见的用法呢，我们要用定冠词 the， 加上形容词之后，再加上 class 这个名词，那泛指呢该社会阶级的群体，所以像是 the working class 劳工阶级 ，the lower class 那就变底层阶级了。再来还有 the middle class 中产阶级 ，the upper class。上层阶级。那此外呢，这些形容词也可以再与 class 以连字号相连作为复合形容词。So for example, Jack comes from a working class family. 好，我们这边看到一个复合形容词 working class. Both his father and his grandfather were miners. 他的父亲和祖父都是矿工。
So the upper classes thought of eating lobsters as a bad thing, a shameful thing, in fact.The adjective shameful means worthy of shame. It's something really bad, something that would seriously embarrass you if you were caught doing it.
可耻的我们可以译作 shameful， 也可以用 disgraceful, humiliating,degrading 这些字来取代。那除了形容词的用法之外呢，这个部分呢也可以用名词，像是我们可以说 found it a shame， 或者是 found it a disgrace， found it a humiliation to eat them 来翻译。So for example, it's shameful how Lisa's boyfriend treats her. I think she should leave him. Lisa 的男朋友对待她的方式很可耻，我认为她应该离开这个男朋友。
So that's the past, but now we'll look at the present, sentence 2. However, lobsters have become highly desirable since the 1950s, and it isn't possible to eat them in many restaurants if you don't order them in advance.
然而呢，龙虾自1950年代变得非常抢手，在许多餐厅，如果你没有事先预定的话，那你就不可能吃到。时态我们要用的是前半句，使用现在完成式，描述从过去持续到今天的状态，也就是从1950年开始到现在。那后半句呢，我们要使用的是现在简单式，描述一个 fact 一个事实。
So the way people view lobsters has changed, partly due to the fact that there aren't as many and they're harder to get, and it's also partly due to the way they're cooked, I think. We've got different ways of preparing and serving them. So before they were shameful, now they're desirable. They are something to be desired. They're high status. They're things that many people want because they're rare and fancy and expensive and tasty.
抢手，那就是值得或渴望能够拥有的东西，所以我们可以用 desirable 这个形容词来形容。那另外呢，也可以翻译为 sought after， 好，尤其指的是因为稀有或是高品质而炙手可热的。For example, Ben collects baseball cards and owns several sought-after items, including a Jackie Robinson card. 那代表 Ben 他收集很多的棒球卡，而且还拥有几件抢手的收藏，包括了一张 Jackie Robinson 的球卡。
Jackie Robinson was the first black baseball player to play in the major leagues of US baseball. He broke what's called the color barrier because the black people were not allowed to play in the white people leagues. But after Jackie Robinson, many other black players played in the MLB. He was a great player. He was very important to history, so a baseball card with him on it is very desirable.Now that sentence also used a dummy pronoun for a subject. We said, it's not possible to eat lobsters if you don't ask in advance. So here, it isn't a pronoun standing for a particular person or thing. We use it to make the sentence complete, to make it actually fit as a sentence.
这边我们看到的虚主词是 it， 那 it 指的是 to eat lobsters， 吃龙虾这件事情怎么样呢？没事先预定是不可能吃到的。那所以啊，本句后半部虽然中文的翻译是你如果就不可能吃到，可是你在翻英文的时候千万不要用 you are not possible to eat them if， 这是完全错误的。你必须要使用以it 为虚主词的句型 it is 加上形容词加上 for somebody to do something， 好，把真正的主词移到 to be 的部分，移到最后。
So if you want to eat lobster, you need to call the restaurant in advance. You need to tell them, hey, we're coming tonight and we're going to order the lobster. Please make sure there is one. Because if you don't, you might get there and the restaurant says, sorry, we've sold out. We only had maybe 6 or 8 today, fresh ones, and they've all been ordered. You should have called in advance. In advance means before you arrive at the restaurant, because doing things in advance is all about preparation, doing it before so that everything is ready and in place. We could say things like ahead of time, ahead, beforehand, prior to arriving, and other things like that to talk about what you do before an event begins to make sure it all goes well.
最后我们要看到事先，好，我们可以译为 beforehand 或是 in advance。那用法上呢，常置于动词之后或者是句子之后。另外形容词 prior 它也有在先的意思，那常置于的就是名词之前，所以本句呢这个部分你也可以译作 if you don't make a prior order， 好，也是可以的。那再给同学们一个例句咯， It's okay if you want to borrow my car, but next time you really need to ask me beforehand。 你要借我的车是没有问题的，但下次你真的要事先询问我。
So that is it. That is how lobsters have kind of changed, and that's an example of how different food habits and the status of food sort of changes over time. I can think of another example from the UK, which was eating goose. Goose was the Christmas meal. In Victorian times, people would get a goose to eat for Christmas because we didn't get lots of turkeys coming over from North America. We didn't have turkeys being farmed in the UK, but we had lots of geese, so people would eat goose.
Okay, so is it expensive or cheap to eat goose there?
Before, it would have been a little bit expensive, but not crazy expensive. Now, eating goose is a lot rarer in the UK, so goose is more expensive. But turkey, especially during Christmas time, is a lot cheaper and more affordable. So it's shown how things have changed. Goose is now considered like a pretty fancy meal that you wouldn't often have, whereas before it would be, this is our Christmas meal.
Wow.
Even if you were a reasonably sort of lower middle class family who could afford a little bit, but not too much.
Have you tried the goose here?
I have not tried any goose ever, I think. I might have tried like pate. It's called foie gras, like the fatty liver stuff that you can get from goose, just to taste it. But as you know, meat, not really my thing.
You don't really like it.
No. Okay, that is all the time we have for today, everybody. Thanks for being with us through this translation unit. Join us again next time for English Digest. I'm Pat.
I'm Elsie.
And we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.